Here in Southeastern Virginia, we've had a very busy morning with some weather issues. So be prepared if there's a kerfluffle with my electricity. I may have to switch over to my cell phone, but we've got that all set up, so it's going to be as seamless as possible. I hope everything is going great wherever you are. And we've got a busy agenda today, so let's get cracking. We're going to review the access to the AP classroom practice. How do you get to those practice questions? We're going to do a crash course through architecture, and just trust me, I know we are not going to do it justice because a lot of stuff happens from the 19th century to the present. And we're also going to take a look at some exam info at the very end. So hang in there with me till the end, and we'll see some stuff that you need to know for the upcoming AP exam. Next week, we're going to have a prep week. So we'll actually be doing, I think, some live testing. John and I will get more information on that tonight, and we'll have more to fill you in on with that probably tomorrow. So let's get started. Whoops. Here we go. Okay, PowerPoint time. And so that's me. If you need me, you can reach me at AC Napier CB on Twitter. Of course, I always have a few seconds for Lovey and Jack. This has been my morning before the rain. We had some adventures in the yard. And now here's Jack last night or the other day helping me with the Egyptian PowerPoint. You can see the seated scribe in the background. So he's resting in his kennel now. And like I always say, we hope he stays that way. Let's get started with this. So how do we get into our optional student practice in AP Classroom? So get to your College Board account, myap.collegeboard.org, log in. The next step, click here for AP Classroom. Then you can access the practice answering what does it say? Free response questions over here on the far left. And then the next one is our YouTube live stream. And please keep in mind that this is for AP Chemistry, I think, or AP Bio, I can't remember. So sorry, no AP Art History screenshots, but the process is the same. And then once you get in, you can start to click around to continue or to begin looking at a prompt. And then put your information in the text box and click submit. Then click yes to submit your response. And now you're going to see how the question is scored. Click yes to review those scoring guidelines. And then you'll see, and you actually have the different tasks and score points up here. So you have to tab through those. So review these to see the examples for what a response should include to earn the maximum number of points. And you'll do that by, again, hitting the scoring guidelines for each part of the question. Then submit or no, submit now to finish. And that should get you where you need to be. So that's just a quick review again. If I went too fast, then please make sure you rewatch this on the video, and you can actually pause it and maybe have a browser open and kind of do this toggling back and forth between the YouTube video and the browser with the login. So as I mentioned, today we are finishing up my part of Unit 4 with a crash course in architecture starting in the 19th century. And just to be clear, like I said, this is a very quick review. The history of modern architecture is a semester-long course. So I have to tell you that I love architecture now, but when I was first starting out as an art historian, like you guys, it was one of the most challenging aspects of art history. So don't get frustrated if you struggle with architectural structures. Everyone does when they start. There's so many parts, and thinking in 3 dimensions and spaces and people moving through spaces can just be a little overwhelming at times, but stick with it. Once you kind of understand how these things work, I think you really will love it. We're going to use skill 3A. So we're going to talk about similarities and differences in architecture, which you certainly know exist just by walking around your own towns and cities. And the changes in architecture, the responses to social, historical context, all of that we see in the 2-dimensional works, we also see in these architectural structures. So we've focused on the forms that we have, as well as the forms that they're responding to, what comes before, and the forms that come after, which they influence. And so for me, cities are always really fascinating conversations across time and space if you look at the buildings and think about what they're saying to each other. So let's start with a map around 1850, which is where we're sort of getting started, maybe a little earlier. Industrialization is happening, right? And you see all the train tracks in red and all these big cities developing, and that's industrialization changes the name of the game. And I'm a little bit of a economic theoretical Marxist. So I always look at how does industry and business impact things. And for me, when one of the biggest things I ever, kind of think about is architecture, because as new tools develop as a result of industry, as we need new spaces for industrial production, as we need housing for workers and in, industrial complexes, these modern cities that grow, of course, these spaces respond to the changes in commerce. And that's just kind of my view of the world, I guess. But we have new materials, new forms of transportation, the dynamic of production influencing society. People are leaving small farms, they're moving to the cities. And some people will embrace industry and modernization. Some will reject it and kind of prefer that look back to the past, and we'll see that in the architecture. So in the face of modernization and industrialization, there's this desire in the 19th century, the Victorian era, as we call it, to return to these earlier values that were considered more pure, because some people thought that modern society had pretty much squandered moral virtue. So modern industrialized skylines of the 19th century were dominated by smokestacks and factories, and that represented this search for profit. So sometimes the medieval city with its church steeples represented this return to piety, moral virtues. And so we have this kind of throwback, this revivalism, this romantic look when we look at early architecture. And Romanticism in architecture is really kind of an umbrella term that we use that covers a lot of European 19th century revivalist and Eastern influence styles. Remember, the British Empire is expanding all over the world. The sun never sets on it. We're discovering lost ancient sites. So we have neoclassical, Greek revival, Gothic revival, Baroque revival, as we see here in the Paris Opera House, which is a kind of Beaux-Arts thing going on as well. And we also get these Saracenic examples like the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. So we have a lot of things going on. In your image set, you have one of these Gothic revival buildings. Westminster, right? The Houses of Parliament, Westminster Hall, the oldest building in Parliament and only part of the ancient Palace of Westminster, which still survives in almost its original form. And it was built at the time, it measured 240 by 67 feet. It had a floor area that covered about 17,000 square feet. So it was gigantic. Built in 1097 under William II. But there was a big fire that happened in Westminster. Oops, sorry. And so we had the old palace burned down, and then there was this competition to rebuild it. And the competition had a stipulation that the new structure had to be designed in one of two historical styles of the English culture, either Gothic or Elizabethan. And so architect Charles Barry believes Gothic is a true and moral style of architecture that's associated with Englishness. So the Gothic revival and the Gothic style stood for this kind of, again, Victorian 19th century fantasy that emphasized medieval artisan craftsmanship and a vanishing tradition of handcrafted things in the face of industry and modernization. So there's this desire of the Victorian era to return to these earlier values that were considered more pure, again, because of the squandering of modern society. So Charles Barry wins the contest, and he begins to rebuild as well as try to keep as much of the original structure in place. And so what you see here is Westminster, the interior with the beams. This was called a hammer beam roof, and the royal carpenter Hugh Herland, that worked for Richard II, said this is the greatest creation of medieval timber architecture ever done. And so this new roof, commissioned around 1393, I think. Here we see the original part that's managed to survive the fire. The central lobby, originally named the Octagon Hall because of its shape, it's the heart of the Palace of Westminster. It lies directly below the central tower, forms a busy crossroads between the House of Lords to the south, the House of Commons to the north, St. Stephen's Hall and public entrance to the west, and the lower waiting hall and the libraries to the east. And it's the location halfway between the two debating chambers. And so it's literally sometimes some political theorists consider it the political center of the British Empire. And it allows a person standing under the great chandelier to see both the royal throne and the speaker's chair and all of these intervening doors that are open. Constituents, so people like you and me, can meet their members of parliament right here in this lobby without an appointment. And this practice is really the original, this is where the term lobbying comes from, by meeting people in the lobby. The hall is also the theater of the speaker's procession, so we see a lot of political pageantry pass through here as well. The Chamber of Lords, located on the southern part of the palace, lavishly decorated. You can see at the south end an ornate gold canopy and throne, also in this Gothic style, right? Lots of pointed and arches, that and kind of gold embellishment that we expect to see with Gothic. And so the sovereign can theoretically occupy that throne during any anything going on, any procedure of parliament, but tends to only reside there actually during the opening of it. Now, Industrial Revolution changes the nature of architecture, as I keep talking about. And we need new spaces for factory work. We have the new use of materials, the functionality of structures. And one of the things that really gets this ball rolling is the Crystal Palace by Joseph Paxton, not in the image set, but it's kind of a pivotal work where we see this is really where our first World's Fair takes place. So we have this large barrel vaulted hall where everybody was coming to display what all of their advances in industry, thanks to Prince Albert. And then on the right, we see the Brooklyn Bridge. So we have all sorts of suspension bridges, new architectural styles coming as industry increases and the needs present themselves. So context matters. You're always going to hear me say that. Louis Henry Sullivan is an American architect, considered the father of skyscrapers and the father of modernism. He's considered the creator of the modern skyscraper, a very influential architect, mentor to Frank Lloyd Wright, who we'll talk about in a little bit, and an inspiration to the Prairie School of Architects, of which Wright was a part. Prior to the 19th century, he's dealing with a theory of architecture, or a kind of a process, or the rules of architecture are the weight of a multi-story building has to be supported by its walls. So kind of like what we see in, in the Romanesque period, this idea of real thick, heavy, load-bearing walls. The taller you built, the heavier the walls had to be. So tall designs meant massively thick walls on the ground floors to really support the height. With the development of cheap and versatile steel in the second half of the 19th century, the rules changed. So again, industrial material comes in and changes the name of the game. America is the most rapid social and economically growing country at the time, and this makes for a lot of great opportunities in architectural design. So this much more urbanized society was forming, and the calling for newer, larger buildings as people are moving to the cities. Property is becoming more and more expensive. So if you need to house a lot of offices or a lot of people, you can either buy a huge plot of land and pay ridiculous amount of taxes on it, or you can buy a small piece of land and build up and still pay the same amount of real estate taxes, at least at the time. So they're dealing with building these frameworks of steel girders, and architects now can build really tall, slender buildings that are very small, or I'm sorry, that are very tall and strong and have a relatively lightweight steel skeleton. So the technical limits of weight-bearing masonry had imposed these structural constraints, but then now all the constraints are gone. And so none of the historical precedents had to be applied. Sullivan, we credit with this idea of form following function. And in 1896, he writes, "It is the pervading law of all things organic and inorganic, of all things physical and metaphysical, of all things human and all things superhuman, of all the manifestations of the head, of the heart, of the soul, that life is recognizable in its expression, that form ever follows function. This is the law." And so he will be a major influence on subsequent builders who will also adopt this as they deal with modern architectural development. So in your image set, you have the Carson Pirie Scott building. This is in Chicago, and I'm actually going to show you some of my pictures from Chicago from visiting this because it is still standing. And you can go visit, although today it is now a Target, which I'll talk a little bit about that too. So we had the Great Fire of 1871, and we have Leopold Schlesinger and David Mayer, Bavarian immigrants come in, moving their dry goods store to the Bowen building at the corner of State and Madison. They hire Adler and his partner, Louis Sullivan, to plan for the removal of that building's attic story, build some additional stories. Then there's some remodeling and renovation that goes on. And so we get this amazing steel framed structure on this corner that is really an institution. And you can see it here on the map of the Chicago Loop as well. So the building allows for a dramatic increase in the window area created down below with these bay windows, right? Actually all along this corner. So the steel frame structure uses post and lintel technique to give very strong and light fireproof steel skeleton. Post and lintel never dies. It just kind of gets reinvented. The exterior of the building consists of a grid of piers and spandrels, and reveals that post and lintel technique that supports it. The design really is one of the first uses of what becomes known as the Chicago window. At the street level, this is where the department store was. So we have all of this window space for displays and this gorgeous cast iron ornamental work as well. Now, when you look at the floor plan, again, this is a response to commerce, industry, new purchasing power of the workers, and the department store was a large open floor plan with columns supporting the roof. It may remind you almost of a hypostyle hall, but this is not a religious temple. It's a temple to commerce, is how I kind of like to think of it. But we do get this large open space. And the building's primary thrust is really much more horizontal than it is vertical. His design emphasizes long, uninterrupted lines running down each window, this wide open space for the display for customers to come in. And you enter through one of two entrances, this corner entryway, and the entire base section, really different from the upper stories because they are trying to attract people from the street, get street traffic in to buy things. Cast iron ornament contains the same highly complicated, delicate, organic floral motifs we see in the Art Nouveau style in Europe and other areas. For Sullivan, the decorative program served as a functional project as well to distinguish the building from those around it and make it attractive to potential customers. And so this is what it looks like today. This is the fanciest Target I've ever been to. And I will show you up here in the corner that Sullivan actually worked his own initials into the design work of this cast iron. So the lower ornamental section here, this disruption pretty much to the planar style of other buildings. And this building's been in continuous operation through today, other than it might be shut down or under restricted admittance for this coronavirus. Sullivan's design really remarkable for the display of products, and you can see the other entrance here on the side. So if we look at the plan, you've got this rounded entrance, the really ornate one, and then that side entrance there. So you actually have two ways in. Inside the entrance, gorgeous woodwork. I mean, really the texture, the sense of craftsmanship, the sense of luxury. You're actually entering into this kind of consumer utopia. If you're ever interested in reading about what's going on this time period, I recommend Sister Carrie, which is a great novel about the Mauve Decade and what's happening in Chicago. Once you're inside, electric lights, appealing display cases, quality goods entice you in. Then you're in there and you're being waited on and catered to, whether you're, a girl working as a secretary in an office or an upper class lady. So this allows you to create and recreate yourself really through what you buy. This idea of purchase power, very important. And these photos are actually still up in the Target. The Target has this amazing, you can see here the Target in the big bay window, which kind of was a little heartbreaking, but you can actually still go up and kind of sit in the window and kind of look. I actually sat down for a few minutes and someone approached me to ask if I was okay. And felt kind of silly. But Target actually moves in 2012 and has had very favorable reviews for its clean design and being very sensitive to the historic character of the structure. And that includes keeping in place that gorgeous field of columns with their ornate capitals, elements of the rail work, the escalator, all of those still here as well. And it includes all of those images of the original store and the restoration process they went to create this new city, or this new temple of commerce, but not necessarily a luxury commerce, but a commerce for the masses with Target. Industrialization combines with colonization as Western Western nations begin to look for raw materials for industry and manufacturing, new markets to sell their goods. So the map, as we now look at all of the globe, well, almost all of it's on here, we see that the Western cultures have their toes in a lot of different areas, and this will not be great for all the cultures that are being colonized. We've talked about colonization with the works from Africa, the removal of objects from context, all those things. That's kind of the other side of this expansion that sometimes doesn't get much attention. I feel like I need to tip my hat here to Art Deco. I'm a big fan of it. It's not in the image set, but it plays an important role in reflecting the modernism, the society, the machine aesthetic of that early 20th century. It has sky-piercing skyscrapers like the Chrysler Building with its metallic ornament. This Art Deco style marks the period of big industry, robber barons, as well as the end of that period with the Depression. The chevron, the sunburst, the fountain, the arc motifs, it's much more rectilinear. It kind of does away with those flowering vegetal patterns that crawl all over the place that we saw with Art Nouveau. And so basically when the stock market crashes in October 29, 1929, this building is mid-construction, and it doesn't lead to the ruin of the building because that happened, so it gets finished. And then it takes on all this kind of symbolic meaning. The Chrysler building after the Depression and World War II becomes a symbol of the city, its foremost culture. It was this beacon of light and kind of this remnant of persistent optimism. But it's certainly a gorgeous structure. If you ever get a chance to go see it, please make it happen. Another thing we need to talk about is the international style, though. That's kind of another trend happening, because we have a lot of different things going on at one time, different schools of thought, different aesthetics. So the international style can be traced to a group of modernists, major figures, including Mies van der Rohe, who we'll talk about, Le Corbusier, who we'll talk about, as well as people like Philip Johnson and Jacobus Ude. The founder of the Bauhaus School, a man named Walter Gropius, is working van der Rohe as one of his instructors there, and starts playing with this steel frame structure with a glass curtain wall. And so the first building built in entirely these Bauhaus design principles that are pretty functional aesthetics, this kind of idea of a utopian structure accessible for the masses and everyone, is this House am Horn on the left by George Mucha, and then Gropius designs the Bauhaus School building on the right the next couple years. So the international style is defined by architects Hitchcock and Johnson, who do a whole exhibit on this at the Museum of Modern Art, is shaped by the Dutch movement de style. We have Mondrian in our image set, as well as Le Corbusier and the Bauhaus. So we talk about Le Corbusier, whose real name was Charles Édouard Jeanneret, but he's known as Le Corbusier, Swiss-French architect, designer, planner, urban planner. He's built in Europe, Japan, India, North and South America, so an international figure. And he's dedicated to providing better living conditions for the residents of crowded cities, and very influential in urban planning. The terms rationalist architecture and modern movement often used interchangeably with the international style. His style characterized by this emphasis of volume over mass, the use of lightweight, mass-produced industrial materials, a rejection of all ornament and color, repetitive modular forms, the use of flat surfaces, typically alternating with areas of glass. And one of the new materials that comes about is reinforced concrete. And according to Le Corbusier, reinforced concrete provided him with incredible resources. And he comes up with this plan for something called a Domino House. And basically it's this, because they had to come up with a lot of housing. I always wondered about this. They had a large number of temporary residents after World War I, and they needed large kind of quickly produced housing. So these large open floor plans that you could actually divide on your own on the interior, residents can build the exterior walls out of whatever material they wanted, and they could divide up the interior to suit their needs. All of these things would be very important. And the house didn't have to necessarily appear on the outside like it did on the inside. Le Corbusier thought of a house as a machine to live in. And so he had 5 points of architecture that and they're all demonstrated here in the work from the image set, the Villa Savoye. The new architecture should be supported with ground level pilotis, these thin columns, elevating the building from the earth and allowing an extended continuity of the garden beneath. It should have a functional roof, relieved of load-bearing walls, allowing walls to be, I'm sorry, I skipped a line, serving as a garden and terrace. So this functional roof is a terrace, claiming the land occupied by the building and giving it back to nature. A free floor plan relieved of any load-bearing walls, so that open space we see in the Domino House plan applied here. Allowing walls to be placed freely and only where aesthetically needed and probably functionally needed to a certain extent. Long horizontal windows providing illumination and ventilation. Freely designed facades serving only as a skin of the wall and windows, unconstrained by the load-bearing considerations below. And so he writes these 5 tenets, and then he begins this building the next year. And this becomes really an icon of modernist architecture. The land in this landscape surrounded by trees, a large lawn. The house is an elegant white box poised on these rows of slender pilotis or pylons, surrounded by a horizontal band of windows that fill the structure with light. There are service areas, parking, rooms for servants, the laundry, all underneath the house. The bedrooms and the salons of the house distributed around a garden. Here's an aerial view and some of the plan views. So the Villa Savoye succinctly sums up these architectural premises that he promotes. The plan is pure, exactly made for the needs of the house, he explains. Now, when we look at the inside, we see those large open spaces. You can see the rooftop terrace here. The plan of the building, again, this is a square, which is an ideal form with curves in the ramp and the grid of the structure. It emphasizes movement, which was important, the free flow of movement throughout the structure. Now, this structure was actually inhabited for only about 10 years before the Savoyes had to leave when World War II breaks out. And during the war, it was occupied first by Germans, then US troops, and it was heavily damaged. And then Savoyes got an $80,000 bill to make it habitable again. And they said, we just can't do that. So the following year, it was pretty much left empty to deteriorate. And so we see this thing, really, this is in one of its worst states of abuse. But the idea that for some, this was actually the natural progression of movement, that the house was still moving, but it just in a different direction. Now it's been restored, fully restored in the 60s. And now we see, actually, this has all been Photoshopped, so don't stress out. Nobody's attacked the Villa Savoye again. But we see Xavier Delory giving us these images where he's Photoshopped graffiti onto this as this kind of attack on the idolization of architecture. So if that's something you're interested, maybe give his work a quick Google. But I was shocked when I first saw these. I was like, oh my gosh, who's attacked the Villa Savoye? But it's such an icon of modern architecture. It's also part of the kind of conversation about what that means, as well as why do we idolize it. Now, depression, right? We have an economic crash, we have a depression, and there's not A lot of, these are pretty dark days for architecture, particularly individual homes. Architects in American history also suffering, but the Works Progress Administration comes in and puts them to work. Lots of people involved in construction put to work building public roads, as well as large public projects like the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, where my friend John lives. And so we have this kind of period where the Depression causes all of this, what do we do? What do we do? And then through building infrastructure for the country and these public projects and schools and all sorts of projects, but not a lot of public home or private homes necessarily, public housing, but not private homes as much. So Frank Lloyd Wright, when all this is going down, he's in his 60s by the time this is happening. And he was a pioneer of the Prairie School in the early part of the century. And his architecture, kind of this prototype of the Usonian home. Most of his works have just recently been made UNESCO World Heritage Sites, so they are protected. But we're talking about him studying under Sullivan, where, Sullivan's not terribly nice to anybody that works for him based on what I've read, but he is working in what we call this kind of prairie style and organicism for Wright that's really kind of integral to all the phases of his work, although he tends to, his style changes certainly. This is the Roble House outside of Chicago. This is about an hour train trip. It's completely worth the walk, and it's right down the street from the Oriental Institute, where you can go, the Chicago's Oriental Institute, where they have the Lamassu and the stuff from the Apadana. So again, this is another one I highly recommend. And you see this style, which is called the prairie style, because again, this idea of the organic nature, the prairies, the fields of the Midwest. This was a low, flat structure kind of mirroring the surrounding environment. And so Wright, when he would design something, he often used these open floor plans, but he designed everything from the furniture, the windows, the carpet, all aspects. He was very important, felt the integrated whole was something very important. Our work by Wright is the Kaufmann House. And at this point, so this is from the early, 1906. And then now we're talking, 30 years later, he's in his 60s. He's struggled financially like everybody else. And his peers were starting to kind of write him off as maybe he was not a one-trick pony, but certainly, people weren't building in the same style, that prairie style anymore. So he gets the commission for Fallingwater, and this is really a personal milestone for him. It marks a turning point in his career. It's kind of a late career triumph, and he would then go on for a lot of other really groundbreaking design. Does this for Pittsburgh department store tycoon Edgar Kaufman Sr. Again, department store money, right? Commerce fueling this idea of the ability to fund something like this vacation home, which is outside of the city of Pittsburgh, allowing you to get away from the industrial city and kind of the pollution and enjoy this beautiful natural environment with the stream and the waterfall. So Kaufman gives Wright this chance to design his weekend home, and the architect rejected the idea of giving a conventional view of the waterfall, audaciously kind of offering to put the house in it. And Kaufman had his reservations. He was worried about, we've got a constant flow of water. What about shoring up this thing and making sure it doesn't fall down, or we have erosion issues, this delicate synthesis of nature and the natural environment. Nature usually wins when we go against nature. So those were some of his kind of concerns, but he says, okay, let's do it. And so we get this work that's really a complete synthesis of these kind of the well-built environment in the natural world. What we see, the stream actually running through parts in the home, emphasizing this connection with nature, which Wright also does through a very liberal use of glass, lots of windows, creative use of corner turning windows without the mullions that cause the corners to kind of vanish. And he even bows to nature by working the trellis around a pre-existing tree. So again, also this intensive concern for the whole structure, taking the bedrock and working it into the floor design. This is again one of those all-encompassing natural environments that he works with the environment and in the environment to create this structure. He'll go on to create this structure again in this kind of organic style for the Guggenheims, this kind of spiraling snail shell of a design where you walk up ramps. It's meant to be this journey through the collection, and you could kind of compare it, I guess, to the spiral of Spiral Jetty as you work your way through that and kind of have this existential experience, hopefully, with the collection. Not a lot of shout outs today because we have so much to do, but I will give shout outs to all of my AP Art History teacher friends and the ones that I don't even know, and all the students. I think all of you deserve a shout out for sticking with these reviews and getting ready. I know it's a lot of anxiety maybe, but you got this, trust me. Born today, Raoul de Keyser, Flemish painter in 1930, Effie McWilliam, surrealist sculptor in 1909, and not an artist or an art historian, but my girl, Wonder Woman, Gal Gadot. There you go. Mies van der Rohe, we also have one of his works. Again, he works at the Bauhaus. He's the director of the Bauhaus when it closes in 1933 with the Nazis' rise to power. He comes to the States like so many artists did, fleeing this kind of oppressive regime that's completely anti anything modern. I mean, remember, Hitler's aesthetic is classicism. So he comes to the States, brings his own particular architectural style, and strives to create a minimal framework for a building that has an architectural order that is pretty much skin and bones. Less is more, according to van der Rohe. He also says God is in the details. So get rid of all that ornament. He's again influenced by this building where he works and works under Gropius, who designs it. So when we look at this and then put it in conversation with his first model for a glass skyscraper, we can certainly see how they segue. Again, the streamlined qualities of the Bauhaus are here, the spacious white lines of the facade, internal structures, the skeletal system. So this is a model, this never comes to fruition. The use of ferro concrete, that reinforced concrete with iron bars. What we look at in the image set is the Seagram building with these new kind of radical simplification of form, this rejection of ornament, the adoption of glass, steel, and concrete. Again, these industrial materials to create this skyscraper that will become typical of the big modern urban cities, right? Transparency of buildings, the construction, the acceptance of industrialized, mass-produced materials, as well as those techniques, give this international style its design philosophy. Ornament is a crime, the truth to materials. Again, form follows function. So all of this, the concrete hidden the structure of the building, and van der Rohe didn't like that. So he uses non-structural bronze-toned I-beams to suggest the structure instead. These are visible from the outside of the building, and they run vertically like mullions surrounding the large glass window. Again, he's using a reinforced concrete. Wait a minute, hold on. The method of construction using an interior reinforced concrete. There we go. Shell, and then we have all of this glass on the exterior. What always kills me about this building when I talk about it is van der Rohe doesn't like ornament or irregularity or things like that. So he had a rule, right? Specified that when you were in that the blinds in this building could either be all the way up, all the way down, or in the middle, but nowhere in between. So just to kind of keep from creating any sort of ambiguities, designs, patterns, I guess, on his building structure. Now, van der Rohe's design will eventually influence things like later skyscrapers like the Sears Tower in Chicago, which is the first to use a tube design where we have 9 tubes clustered in this 3x3 matrix. This is not in the image set, but yet again, another fantastic site to visit if you're in the Chicago area. So all my people in Chicago, hopefully you've seen all of these fantastic things. And so we move on, because after you strip things down for so long and you create these big glass boxes, and remember this industry that we're talking about in the American cities, and I always think about Mad Men and kind of these kind of large corner office skyscrapers. This is a largely predominantly kind of white normative society. And there's a lot of other voices out there, and they start clamoring to be heard. After, we have the 1950s and the 1960s. So the 50s are post-war economic boom, skyscrapers. The 60s, we have, right, Vietnam War, 2 assassinations. We have civil rights movements. So we have a lot of upheaval in the country, people clamoring to be heard. We're dealing with Jim Crow South. So by the time we get to the 70s, women, people of color, people of different sexual orientations, all of them have a voice. They want to be heard, and it isn't reflected in the white rectangular box. And so this idea of bringing in new aesthetics, challenging the limitations of the form follows function, this idea, the adding of decorative elements, this structures that are asymmetrical, illogical, different, show different traditions, becomes very, very attractive. We still see some new materials coming in, things we don't think of when we look at architecture, like neon, which we see here with the Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans. You see it by day and by night, clearly channeling, right, triumphal arches, some of the elements we've seen in some of the Roman structures that we've studied, but taking it and putting a 20th century spin on it. It's eclectic, it's not restrictive, it has personality, it doesn't, modern architecture is so sterile and rectilinear. This is plural visions, complexity, eclecticism. It's anything but reductive. It's inclusive, and that's where society wanted to kind of head. Stressing the belief, well, some people, stressing the belief that uniformity and anonymity in the modernist architecture are really unsuited to human interaction. Like, people don't exist in glass boxes. And so diversity is really a great advantage of urban life. And why aren't we celebrating it? So postmodern architecture really embraces and accepts the messy and chaotic nature of urban life. Postmodern architects are collecting different aesthetics. They're mixing them up and doing really interesting things with them, selecting architectural elements and references, juxtaposing them in new ways. Functional and formalized shapes and spaces of modernist architecture replaced by diverse aesthetics that collide in style. The forms are adopted just because they're interesting for their own sake, and new ways of seeing familiar sites and spaces. It's, again, eclecticism is the word. The image from the image set you have is the Venturi House in Newcastle. And this is pretty much a kind of a modest but instructive example of postmodern style by Robert Venturi, John Rauch, and Denise Scott Brown. And Venturi and Brown are husband and wife, and he builds this, again, to express his belief that this orthodox modern architecture and city planning had run its course. And so he does this work out in Newcastle County. And what I find interesting is when we put it in conversation with Le Corbusier. So why don't you take a second, come up with some ways to use your visual analysis skills, come up with a couple ways that these structures differ. So we can kind of start with the setting, right? Unlike the Villa Savoye, the Venturi House is not on top of a hill. It's not hovering over a well-trimmed lawn. This house is surrounded by rolling fields and a thickly wooded forest. It kind of reminds us of an American farmhouse and barns. It has painted siding that's white, intersecting gables. And so it's not the square box. It doesn't have the pilotis windows. It has these kind of references to classical antiquity with this pseudo pedimental front that's actually cropped off here and seems to be missing part of one of its columns. So we have different materials, different setting, complete different use of aesthetics, and the modernist international style versus postmodernism. And it's an interesting way to kind of put these two styles in conversation. We talk about the front and rear facades, this kind of false facade that seems to float. The couple that lived here were bird watchers. This might have been some sort of blind that they hid behind to actually watch the birds in the backyard. The interior, they were also, one of them was a musician. So we have this very playful interior that is got this craftsman-like quality, very unique to the site. Lots of ornaments back with postmodernism, right? So as if these were cut by hand or a jigsaw specific for this music room in the house. Other sites by Venturi show us a lot of the same, free borrowing, juxtaposition, collaging, and in reinterpreting forms from the classical past or other architectural styles. And then this continues on. We get works by Piano, one of the most contested sites in all of France, with its outside in, with all of its structure on the outside. So the Pompidou not in the image set. We'll keep on going because we're running out of time. And then this is in Unit 10, which we're not covering in the image set, but this is kind of another step in postmodernism, the deconstructivism of Frank Gehry, who I argue is really a sculptor more than an architect. And he can do this because of industrial software, CAD software developed by the French to create airplanes. So these haphazard volumes, masses, planes, borders, all of these things, this kind of wave of the future where architecture heads. Now, let's take a few minutes and kind of go through what's going on with your exam. So the exams this year, it's not going to be harder to earn a high score of 3, 4, or 5. So stay calm, read each question, work very carefully through. They are not curved. They're never curved. You're not competing against any other students. You are scored. Your responses are scored individually. I've scored these exams. I'm telling you the truth. Don't worry if you don't get all parts of the question completed. Make sure you do a thorough job on what you are working on and what you get through. This happens every year. So please keep that in mind and just take a deep breath and keep on going. You need a good testing environment. And that's one reason we've shortened it to 45 minutes this year, because good Lord, I wish I had 45 minutes to myself to take an exam right now. So that's one reason the exams are shorter. We want you to have a fair opportunity. Keep in mind that disruptions happen. And so, just it's going to be okay. We're all going to get through this together. The questions are going to be viewed by you on a web browser, and then you're going to have 3 different ways to submit your responses. You're going to either type right in to a text box, right? Or type, you're going to copy and paste a typed response. So let's start there. Google Docs, Microsoft Word, no images, don't put any images in. Make sure you've got your AP ID and initials at the top of the pages. Make sure you've got your browser set up. Make sure you have everything ready ahead of time that you might need. You can attach the document, so you can either type it, copy and paste it right in. You can just save it and submit it. And these are the file formats: doc, docx, PDF, text, and ODT. Again, make sure your AP ID and initials are on these responses, and that will be on your ticket that you'll get through email. You can also do a handwritten one and then take a picture and upload it that way. So that's fine. So, and you'll have to probably go back through and read all of these slides word for word, since we're running a little short on time, but I wanted to make sure you had this information. 5 things to do, and there's actually a checklist you can print out for this exam. Review your contact information. I mentioned this a couple of days ago. Make sure you go in, you've logged in, and you have a good email address where you're going to get your ticket emailed to you. Check your tech, make sure you've got your devices ready. Any documents you're going to use, don't start scrambling on the day of the exam. Get that stuff ready the night before. Practice submitting your response. So starting Monday, you will be able to actually go in and practice trying to upload your work, so you know the process. So again, that's not a guess, I don't know what's going on thing. We want you to be as prepared as possible for this. Get all your stuff together, additional materials, gather what you need for each exam, not just art history, but if you're doing AP Bio or AP World, get everything kind of organized. Don't wait till the last minute. And then you'll get your exam confirmation and e-ticket in your email. So this checklist, you can download it at cb.org AP checklist, the 5 steps that go into much more detail. Exam day, and we are a 2-question exam. So the timing is going to go like this: 30 minutes before your local start time, right? And don't make sure you keep in mind all the time changes, time zones. Log in, get ready. Question will appear. You'll have 25 minutes for question 1 to develop that response. Then you'll get a time. There'll be a timer. You can run your own timer if you want, but there will be a timer on the screen. After 25 minutes, you'll get 5 more minutes, and then you need to start thinking about submitting your response. You need to get it in that 5 minutes. Afterwards, question 2 appears. Read the question, develop a response, and then you'll have 5 minutes to get it uploaded. Your testing environment. Get rid of distractions. Now I realize everybody's home with little brothers and sisters and stuff like that. But do the best you can. Let everybody know you're going to be testing. Make sure everything's charged up. Try to get people off your bandwidth. You know, maybe tell people to put together a puzzle instead of playing Fortnite or streaming Netflix while you're doing this. Just give you the 45 minutes to do this. Again, have your checklist ready and make sure you're checking through everything. Exam security, make sure you're only doing your own work. You're only using your own test exam ticket number. There's a plagiarism scanning software. I use that for my students, and it tells you if you've copied and pasting stuff right off the internet, don't do it. It's not worth it. You won't, your scores won't be counted. So these responses will eventually get their way to your teachers. So please make sure if you have any questions about security, you can click on that on the collegeboard.org. When you check into your exam, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get your AP ID and the email, your ticket number. Put that in. You're going to, once you log into the system, you're going to have a timer showing you when the exam, a countdown to when the exam starts. Then you're going to answer your questions. One of the things I thought was kind of important is that you can use spell check and grammar check. They don't provide you any advantage. We don't worry about that stuff. If you have a Grammarly plugin, though, please disable it or the exam won't work. So make sure make sure you go to the site, the AP exam site, and go through these screens and make sure you understand things about plugins, web browsers, all that stuff. This is what the timer looks like, right? Time left to submit your work. You'll get this red change of the timer here. So when you're testing, it's going to be black and then it's going to go to red. 5 minutes before time's up, it turns red. Stop where you are and start trying to submit. There's going to be a lot of people doing the same thing you're doing. So, wrap it up, submit it. You know what you're doing. You're going to be fine. Do what you got to do. You're going to upload it, right? Or attach the photos or paste it, right? And then submit. If something goes wrong, and I really encourage you, we all encourage you at the College Board to take this exam on the first test date, because if you wait, if you're like, I don't feel like I'm ready, I think I'm going to take it on the second one, there's no backup plan for that. So like, let's say you're taking your test and in something, your little brother runs through the room and something happens, or you get sick or something. And this happens every year in real testing, other than the little brother running through stuff. You want to make sure that you have the second attempt if you need it in June. So go ahead and do it in May. Get it done. Breathe a sigh of relief. You're ready. I know you're ready. So make sure you submit. And things that could go wrong, it happens. Don't call the customer service center. If something goes wrong on the first try, your device crashes, you lose internet service, this happens, you have a thunderstorm going on like I do here, then this can happen. It's okay, and there's always a request makeup site here that you can go to. Scores are scored by readers like me and like John, and we will have these scores. It'll take us a little longer to get them back to you this year, but we're saying around July 15th, you should know what you scored on the AP exam. And then our college is going to give us the same amount of credit. Yes, of course they are. So we've talked to different colleges and universities, and they are accepting credit as usual. So don't worry about that either. Everything's going to be fine. And I think it's kind of fear of the unknown at this point. But trust me, you're going to do great. you're ready. John and I know you're ready. So I just want you to kind of breathe a sigh of relief and settle in and just take a deep breath, and it's going to be all good. Check your browser, make sure you're using one that works. So again, that whole check your tech thing, very important. Again, cb.org/AP2020. If you can't access the demo on May 4th, which is Monday, which is like the trial run, then that shows you need to adjust your browser or change it. Oh my gosh, homework review. Okay, so forgot about this part. John gave us these two images. On the right, we have the lamentation from the Scrivania Chapel. Intended audiences of the work. We have the Carl Liebknecht work on the left that he talked about yesterday. So for the right, the Scrivania family were the patrons and anyone that went into the chapel. So we have a religious setting, an audience for this. The Kollwitz work is a print, mass produced for the followers of Liebknecht, who was this communist leader killed in police custody. So that's a much wider dissemination of information. Explain two artistic choices that elevate the feelings of grief. Well, we have the enclosed setting. We have the body laid prostrate in the front, the intense emotionalism of the mourners, all of these things. And this, the setting, again, that kind of rock that cuts us off from the deep space. And then, of course, all the mourners and crowded around. All of that gives us a sense of that kind of intense closeness that they feel to the deceased. I'm almost done, I promise. AP exam practice, this is you. These are images of the Houses of Parliament, the interior and the exterior of the Palace of Westminster, designed by Barry and Pugin. Describe at least two visual characteristics. Using at least two examples of specific visual evidence, explain how the visual characteristics of the Palace of Westminster reference older architectural traditions. Using specific contextual evidence, explain why the architects chose to include these references to earlier architectural traditions in the building. And we're done, almost, right? Lovey and Jack, here they are. And so tweet me if you have any questions. If you're interested in seeing anything else we can squeeze into a YouTube session, we'll see what we can do with prep week. Let me know. And if you have any questions about the exam, shoot them to me. I may not know, but I bet I can find you an answer. That's all for now. Thank you so much for tuning in and for sticking with me. I know I went long today, but hopefully I got you some information you needed. And I'll see you next week. Stay healthy, art historians.